The German Grand Prix has either been held at the Nürburgring or the Hockenheimring for every year since F1 began in 1950. Well, actually, every year apart from one, and that will be the 1959 German Grand Prix held at one of the craziest circuits to ever be used in all of motorsport. It was incredibly long, incredibly fast, and most definitely incredibly deadly, and today I'm going to be talking about just that. Welcome to the complete history of the AVUS street circuit. Ideas for a circuit in Berlin began as early as 1907, before finally being put into action with the construction of the AVUS circuit beginning in 1913. The construction fell silent, however, after World War I broke out the next year, but racing at AVUS would finally begin after construction had finished in 1921, and this was the result. Just by looking at the layout, you can see this track was weird, even when comparing it to some of the other crazy circuits from back then, like Pescara, Reims, or even the combined Monza circuit. It consisted of two massive straights around 6 miles long each, which were a closed off dual carriageway, before coming up to two corners to connect the cars back to the other side of the road, with a single lap being 12.1 miles long. And to put that into comparison, that's almost 3 times longer than Spa, the longest circuit currently used in F1. Now that I've talked about AVUS as a track, let's talk about the racing that happened there. Racing began there in 1921, but more prominently it hosted the first of only 2 Grand Prix held throughout its lifetime, being the 1926 German Grand Prix won by Mercedes driver Rudolf Caracciola. Interestingly enough, this was technically a multi-class event, as it featured both Grand Prix cars and sports cars, after officials realised there wasn't many cars that raced under Grand Prix regulations. Case in point, earlier that year at the 1926 French Grand Prix, only 3 cars started the race, due to barely anyone being able to get a car ready that qualified under Grand Prix regulations. And to top it all off, only 1 single car finished the race, and we thought the 2005 US Grand Prix was bad. This is on another level. Anyway, the 1926 German Grand Prix at AVUS was also met with tragedy, when driver Adolf Rosenberger crashed and killed 3 people along the way. Unfortunately, these will be the first of many deaths that will take place on the fearsome circuit of AVUS throughout its lifetime. After this inaugural German Grand Prix at AVUS in 1926, the event moved on to the much more popular, newly built Nürburgring, leaving AVUS behind out of the centre stage. But 10 years later, in 1936, the most infamous part of AVUS was built. Dubbed the Wall of Death, the northern loop was replaced by a long banked left-hander approached at almost top speed. The banking at the northern loop was steep, incredibly steep, at a crazy 43 degrees. To put that into comparison, the banking at Indianapolis is only 11 degrees, almost 4 times less than the banking at AVUS. And the largest banking still in use today, being at Winchester Speedway, is only 37 degrees, still a whole 6 degrees shy of the banking at AVUS. Also, another noteworthy mention about the Northern Loop is that until the early 60s there was nothing protecting you from flying off the edge. No guardrails, no wall, nothing. The building of this banking came at a bad time, however, as World War II broke out not long after and AVUS once again lay dormant during wartime. However, a whole 33 years later, after its first Grand Prix, AVUS will make a resurgence as part of the new Formula 1 World Championship, hosting the German Grand Prix in 1959. By now, to improve safety, the circuit was half as long as it was in 1926, only 5.5 miles, However, 9-time podium sitter Jean Behre was killed at AVUS in the pouring rain during a sports car race just 1 day before the Formula 1 event. So needless to say, the circuit was still terrifyingly deadly, as basically all circuits were back in the 50s, 60s and 70s. Anyway, pole position was taken by Tony Brooks, 9/10 of a second in front of the hard-charging Sterling Moss, and the 30-lap race was eventually won by Brooks, followed by Dan Gurney and Phil Hill, making it a Ferrari 1-2-3 finish, which is sad to think about looking at Ferrari in 2020. The race also contained a massive crash for German driver Hans Hermann on lap 36 after hitting a hay bale and sending his car into a roll. Unbelievably, he was launched out of his car and completely unhurt, which is incredible considering how dangerous the cars were back in the 50s. This is probably the only time in the history of motorsports where the lack of a seatbelt actually saved someone's life. Anyway, after the 1959 German Grand Prix, the circuit's time in the spotlight was over and would never host a World Championship Grand Prix again. 2 years later, in 1961, Grand Prix racing was banned on circuits with dangerous bankings, including the likes of AVUS and the old Monza, for example. And by 1967, the AVUS banking was completely demolished, leaving the Northern Loop as a regular flat corner, as it had been before 1936. Over time, the circuit then began to get shorter and shorter, as the Southern Loop was moved closer and closer to the Northern Loop to improve safety. The circuit was now a shell of its former self, unrecognisable of how it used to look back when it was a Grand Prix venue. By now, the circuit had moved away from high-level open-wheel racing like Formula 1 into touring car racing, most prominently its introduction into the DTM Championship in the mid-80s. However, it was certainly not a great track for racing, and it was clear that AVUS would not be in operation for much longer. Also, from a financial side of things, closing down an entire motorway in Berlin for a race, I assume, was incredibly expensive, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, as more and more traffic came in and out of the city, leading to more and more problems. However, the real nail in the coffin for the AVUS circuit came in 1995 under tragic circumstances. At an event as part of the Super Touring Car Championship, driver Keith O'Dore was killed in a crash after spinning and colliding with the car behind, going at full speed. By 1998, racing at AVUS had finally come to an end, and now remains as a normal motorway for every day of the year. In my opinion, AVUS is by far the craziest circuit ever used in motorsport, and at the same time probably the most deadly. The Wall of Death banking is probably the most ridiculous corner ever used, and it's crazy to think that it somehow was deemed safe enough for racing to happen there. So there you go, that was the complete history of AVUS, from its first race in 1921 to its last race 77 years later in 1998. But anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to subscribe, comment, share, and I'll be back in the next video. See ya!